The day Lawrence Beaudet walked into his welding shop and found a woman in a charcoal blazer standing in his driveway, he thought she'd taken a wrong turn. She hadn't. The woman's name was Catherine Voss. She was the regional director of Northgate Industrial Solutions, a mid-sized manufacturing firm that had been quietly expanding across northern Ontario for the better part of a decade. She stood next to a black company SUV, arms folded, studying the front of Beaudet Metalworks the way someone studies a car at an auction, not to admire it but to find reasons to walk away. Lawrence had built that shop with his hands, not as a figure of speech. He had poured the concrete floor himself over 3 weekends in the early spring of 2009. Working beside his brother-in-law with a borrowed mixer and bags from the hardware store in Sudbury. He had welded the steel frame of the lean-to extension in 2014 when he'd taken on his first apprentice. Every dent in the corrugated siding had a story behind it, and Lawrence knew them all. He set down the coffee he'd been carrying and walked toward her. "Can I help you?" Catherine Voss looked him over, the work boots, the worn Carhartt jacket, the grease that never fully washed out from under his fingernails, and her expression did not change. "We've been having ongoing problems with a fabrication line at our facility in Chelmsford," she said. "Your name came up. Someone said you do custom parts." "I do. Small operation," she said, more to herself than to him. She glanced at the sign above the bay door. The paint was faded, the lettering slightly uneven because Lawrence had done it himself and his handwriting had never been precise. "I wasn't expecting quite this small." Lawrence said nothing. She tilted her head. "How long have you been running this place?" 17 years. She nodded slowly, like that number meant something unflattering to her. "We typically work with certified facilities. We have a vendor qualification process. Multiple inspections, compliance documentation." She paused. "I'm not sure this would clear our standards." Lawrence looked at his shop. He looked at it the way you look at something you've spent 17 years pouring yourself into. Not through a visitor's eyes, but through the eyes of someone who knows what it took to keep the lights on through 2 recessions, through a divorce. Through the year his rotator cuff gave out and he had to run the whole operation one-armed for 4 months. He knew the shop was not glamorous. He also knew what he could do inside it. "You want the parts or not?" he asked. Catherine Voss almost smiled, not kindly. "Leave your card," she said. "I'll be in touch if we decide to move forward." She said it the way people say things they don't mean, the sentence already drifting away from her as she turned back to the SUV. She drove away. Lawrence picked up his coffee, went inside, and got back to work. He didn't expect to hear from her. He did expect to think about that conversation more than he should have, standing at the welding table in the evenings when the shop was quiet. Not out of wounded pride, or not only that, it was something more specific. She had looked at the building and decided what it was capable of without asking him a single question about his work. She hadn't asked to see his equipment, hadn't asked about tolerances or materials or turnaround times. She had looked at the paint on the sign and made her calculation. Lawrence Beaudet was 53 years old. He had grown up in Sturgeon Falls and moved to Chelmsford in his late 20s when he married Diane. The marriage had lasted 11 years and produced 2 daughters, now grown. After the divorce, he had thrown himself into the shop with the kind of focus that is, if he was honest with himself, partly avoidance. He had become very good at what he did. He had a small client list, but a loyal one. Forestry equipment manufacturers, a mining supply company out of Timmins, a marine fabricator in Parry Sound who sent him work twice a year. They came back because his tolerances were tight, his delivery was reliable, and he answered his phone. Not because his sign had good paint. 3 weeks after Catherine Voss drove away from his driveway, his phone rang. It was a man named Doug at the Chelmsford facility, calling to say that Northgate's usual supplier had missed a deadline on a critical bearing housing, and they needed a replacement fabricated in under a week. Doug sounded apologetic about calling. He said Catherine's name in a way that suggested she didn't know he was making this call. "What are the specs?" Lawrence asked. Doug sent the drawings that afternoon. Lawrence looked them over and recognized immediately that the original machining had been done wrong. The tolerance on the bore was too loose, which had probably been causing vibration issues for longer than the missed deadline. He called Doug back. "You've got a bigger problem than the part," he said, and explained what he was seeing. There was a long pause. "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen this housing before. Different manufacturer, same error. It's a common mistake on this style of press fit. You want me to fix it right or just make you a copy of the broken thing?" Another pause. "Fix it right," Doug said. Lawrence had the part ready in 5 days. He delivered it himself, driving the pickup truck to the facility on a Tuesday morning. Doug met him at the loading dock. They tested the fit in the line before Lawrence left. It seated perfectly. The vibration that had been troubling the line for, Doug eventually admitted, almost 8 months stopped. Lawrence drove home. He heard nothing from Catherine Voss. He heard from Doug again 6 weeks later and then again after that. The calls came through Doug every time, and Lawrence understood that this was intentional. Catherine Voss was receiving the benefit of his work while maintaining plausible distance from having endorsed it. That was fine. He wasn't doing it for her endorsement. Over the next year and a half, Lawrence fabricated 17 components for the Chelmsford facility. Each one was delivered on time. Several of them involved him identifying problems in the original drawings that would have caused failures downstream. He noted these in writing every time, sending Doug a brief memo that outlined what he'd changed and why. Doug forwarded these memos up the chain. Lawrence knew this because the problem stopped repeating. He started building a file, not out of any particular plan at first. He just kept copies of the drawings, the memos, the delivery receipts. He was methodical by nature. It's what made him a good machinist. It was Doug who one afternoon in early spring let something slip. "Between you and me," Doug said, lowering his voice in a way that suggested the loading dock was not entirely private, "we're having conversations about the future of this facility. There's pressure from head office to consolidate, pull production back to the plant in Barry." He paused. "It's been on the table for a while." Lawrence absorbed this. When would that happen? Could be 18 months, could be sooner, nothing official yet. Doug looked at the floor. "Be a lot of people out of work up here." Lawrence thanked him for telling him and drove home thinking about it for a long time. He did something then that he hadn't done in years. He hired an accountant. Not his cousin who did his taxes, but an actual business accountant. A woman named Beverly he found through a referral from the mining supply company in Timmins. He sat across from her in her office in Sudbury and told her he wanted to understand the full financial picture of Beaudet Metalworks. Not just the year-to-date numbers, the assets, the liabilities, the borrowing capacity, the realistic ceiling on what the operation could support. Beverly looked at his records and asked 3 pointed questions. Then she told him what he had. It was more than he'd thought. 17 years of steady, debt-averse operation had built something he'd been underestimating. He owned the land outright. He owned the equipment outright. His receivables were clean. His credit rating was, Beverly told him with mild surprise, very good. "What are you thinking about doing?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "I want to know what's possible first." He spent the next few months learning things he didn't know. He took a course in industrial business acquisition through an online program offered through Laurentian University. He read everything he could find about manufacturing consolidation in Northern Ontario. He talked to 2 people he trusted, a former client who had sold his shop to a larger operation, and an old friend from Sturgeon Falls who'd spent 30 years in commercial real estate. He asked them questions and he listened. He did not tell either of them what he was considering, because he wasn't sure yet. But the shape of something was forming in his mind, and he needed to understand it from all angles before he moved. The announcement came on a Friday in November. Northgate Industrial Solutions was closing the Chelmsford facility, effective March 31. Production to be consolidated in Barry, the building and equipment to be liquidated. Lawrence read the press release on the Regional Business News website on his phone. Standing in the shop, he read it twice. Then he called Beverly. "That facility we talked about," he said. "I want to know what it would take." She already knew what he was referring to. She had been expecting this call for 2 months. "Come in Monday," she said. "We'll work through it." The building was larger than he needed. That was intentional. He'd need room to expand if this worked the way he thought it could. The equipment list from the liquidation was significant. 2 CNC machining centers, a large press brake, laser cutting table, welding bays, inspection equipment. Some of it was older than he'd have liked. Most of it was serviceable. The price, when it came, was lower than he'd expected. Northgate wanted the liability off their books before the fiscal year closed. Beverly negotiated hard and Lawrence stayed out of it except to set the ceiling he was willing to reach. They came in beneath it. He signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in February in a conference room in Sudbury. His daughters didn't know yet. Doug didn't know yet. He drove home alone in the truck, stopped at the Tim Hortons on the edge of town, ordered a medium double-double, and sat in the parking lot for a while. He had just bought the building that Catherine Voss had driven away from his shop to work in. The morning she had looked at his faded sign and decided what he was worth. He thought about that for a long time in the parking lot. Then he finished his coffee and drove home. The transition took 4 months. He brought on 2 machinists from the closed facility, men who knew the equipment, men who had been with the Chelmsford shop for years and had been quietly dreading the commute to Barry. He kept his original apprentice, a young man named Tristan, who had been with him for 3 years, and who had the patience and spatial reasoning that Lawrence believed could not be taught. He hired Beverly part-time to manage his books properly, which she had been telling him to do for years. He renamed the company. Not dramatically, just expanded it, Beaudet Fabrication and Machining Limited. He ordered a new sign. He agonized over the font for longer than he would admit to anyone. He began reaching out to clients that Northgate had been supplying from the Chelmsford facility. He had the records, the components, the tolerances, the delivery history. He had made many of those parts himself, already knew the specifications. He offered shorter lead times and direct communication with the person doing the work. He did not tell any of them that he had bought the building. The work came. Slowly at first, then steadily. By the end of the first year, his revenue was 3 times what Beaudet Metalworks had ever generated. By the end of the second year, he had taken on a third machinist and was in conversation with a forestry equipment company about a supply agreement that would have been inconceivable from the old shop. He did not contact Catherine Voss. He did not send her anything. He did not make any gesture toward her existence. She contacted him. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October, more than 2 years after he'd signed the papers. His shop manager, the senior machinist he'd brought over from the old Northgate facility, a man named Earl who had 35 years of experience and an opinion about everything, put his head into the office and said, "There's a woman out front asking for you. Says she's from a company called Meridian." He said it the way Earl said most things, flatly as a fact delivered without editorial comment. Lawrence looked up from the drawings he'd been reviewing. "Did she give a name?" "Voss," Earl said. Lawrence set the drawings down. He took off his reading glasses and set those down too. He sat for a moment. "Send her in," he said. Catherine Voss looked exactly as he remembered her, which was to say composed. Whatever she had been expecting when she walked in, she managed not to show it. She looked at the office, at the equipment visible through the window to the shop floor, at the framed copies of the certifications on the wall, at the supply agreement documentation stacked on the corner of the desk, and her face remained still. She sat down across from him. "I'm with Meridian Precision now," she said. "I left Northgate 18 months ago." She said it cleanly, without apparent emotion about it. "We're a smaller operation. We're building a supplier network, and your name has come up several times." "From whom?" She named 3 companies. Lawrence recognized all of them. 2 were clients of his. "What are you looking for?" he asked. She told him, a long-term supply agreement, 12 to 18 months initially, with a review option. The volume was significant. It would require him to prioritize their work during peak periods. Lawrence listened to all of it. He asked several questions about specs and lead times and payment terms. She answered them directly. She was good at her job. He could see that clearly. She always had been. Her error had never been competence. When she had finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "I have to be honest with you," he said. Something shifted in her face. "Not much, but something. I remember when you came by my old shop," he said. "You stood in my driveway for about 3 minutes and decided we weren't qualified. You didn't ask about my equipment or my work history or my tolerances. You looked at the sign." She was quiet for a moment. "I remember," she said. "I'm not saying that to make a point," Lawrence said. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand where I'm coming from when I tell you I'll need to see your documentation before I commit to anything. Your client list, your payment history, your projections for the contract period." He paused. "I run a qualified facility now. My vendors have to clear standards." He said it without edge. He said it the same way she had said it to him, as a statement of process, professional and impersonal. Catherine Voss looked at him for a moment. "That's fair," she said. They talked for another 40 minutes. By the end, she had agreed to send the documentation by end of week. Lawrence walked her out through the shop. Earl was at one of the CNC machines and didn't look up. The floor was clean and organized and loud with productive noise. At the door, Catherine Voss paused. "You built something real here," she said. It was the first thing she had said that wasn't about business. She said it simply, without performance, the way people say things they weren't necessarily planning to say. "I know," Lawrence said. She nodded once and left. He watched the car pull out onto the road and disappear. Then he went back to the office, put his reading glasses on, and picked up the drawings he'd set down. The documentation arrived Friday afternoon as promised. It was thorough. The numbers were solid. Beverly reviewed it over the weekend and called him Monday morning to tell him it looked clean. He accepted the contract, not because she had acknowledged what she'd said in his old driveway, not because it completed something, or corrected anything, or proved a point he'd been carrying around for years. He accepted it because the numbers were good and the work was work, and he ran a business now, and that's how a business runs. But some evenings, when the shop had gone quiet and he was the last one there, Lawrence would stand in the bay and look at the floor. The concrete floors of a building he had purchased that someone had once driven away from to go work somewhere smaller, and he would feel something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite satisfaction but was in the same neighborhood as both. He had never needed anyone to see it coming. He had only needed to know what he was building.